Alright, Ada. In our last episode, right, we actually stopped at the coming in of the British, right? When they used the cascade of wars, the series of endemic wars all around the region as the excuse to establish colonial rule, right? Mostly at first in the southern part of the country, starting from the mid 18th century, of course. That's where we stopped in the previous episode, right? Well, now, welcome.
Who started?
Welcome to episode 3 of the podcast.
It's your host, Ada.
Yes, and it's I, the scientist. You're welcome. In this new episode, right, we're calling it the history of early Nigeria, right? And we'll be discussing the history of the entity, right?
As we know as Nigeria.
Exactly, that we now know as Nigeria. How did it come to be? How everything about it, from the name,
what the name means,
to the area it encompasses, right? So that's what we'll be discussing in this episode. Okay, we talked about how we ended the last episode, right?
Yes.
And we hope you enjoyed that, and we hope it was informative and educative.
I hope you didn't think it was lengthy.
Well, it was lengthy, but the length was for a reason.
Yes.
We hope you enjoyed it anyways. As long as you enjoyed it, the end has been achieved. Now, the entity, the country, right, we know as Nigeria today, the region, we established in the previous episode that it's been inhabited by various people.
Thousands of years.
Exactly. Tribes, kingdoms, empires through the ages. Right? Now, so meaning that the region itself has not been known by a single name over the years. Right? In fact, it didn't get to be known by as a single entity or as a single with a single name until the 19th century, right? So we'll come to talk about shortly after this, of course, about the various names it was known by over those years, and how did the name Nigeria itself come to be. So why don't we start from there? If you're going to discuss the early history, as well start from the name, right? So how did the name Nigeria come to be?
I know it's related to the river Niger somehow. So
definitely.
How exactly?
Now, the name Nigeria, right? The name Nigeria was first coined and proposed for usage to refer to the area and the country as we know it today by Flora Shaw. I'm sure this is a popular story. People know it. They tell us how Flora Shaw was the one who proposed the name and so on and so forth. But I think what many people don't understand, what they don't get, is how it came to be and when exactly did it happen.
Yeah. And a question that should bother us is, where did the river, the Niger itself, where did the name come from?
Exactly. Now, Flora Shaw coined the name and proposed it for usage not in 1885, as many people tend to think. You know about the Berlin Conference of 1885, when the continent was split between the European powers. So people think that was where the name was given. And at that point, it wasn't given that name. It had a different name. It was better at that point. We'll come to discuss what name it was, of course, later on. But the Flora Shaw coined the name and proposed it for usage actually in the year 1897, right? She was working as a journalist and writer for the Times newspaper, which is a British newspaper that she worked for then. Here we have an excerpt from the piece she wrote that day when she coined the name. Here she is saying, "The name Nigeria, applying to no other part of Africa, may without offense to any neighbors be accepted as coextensive with the territories over which the Royal Niger Company has extended British influence, and will serve to differentiate them equally from the colonies of Lagos and the protectorates on the coast and from the upper Niger." Now, that was she writing in the year 1897, 8th January to be precise. to break down what she was saying here, she was essentially referring to the fact that the region was being referred to by some other names prior to this that was basically a derivative of the name that other regions in Africa were already called then. For example, one of the prominent names at this time that was being used to refer to the area known as Nigeria today was Central Sudan. So people are proposing that they call it Central Sudan. Right? But there was already Sudan, the country there, that was also an area of British influence then. So she was proposing that why not get a unique name, right? Instead of using a name that the other neighbors in the region already claim rights to. Right? Exactly.
So odd.
Right. Well, it wouldn't be new if they had used the name then. I mean, we would all know ourselves as Central Sudanese today. So it would just be the norm. But then, yes, she did coin the name Nigeria. But where did she get the name from? Right. The name Nigeria, of course, was derived from the name of the prominent river in the region. That is the River Niger.
Great River Niger.
Right. And that river itself is known to many inhabitants of the region, right? The locals of the region by many different names, right? You have people who live in different areas calling it different names, like the Yorubas call it Oya, right? The Nupes call it Edu. I think Edu is the right pronunciation for that.
And then it's Para Hausa.
Yes, I think the Hausas call it Kwara. Exactly. And then but the name itself, right, the first stages of the name is attributed to the North African European diplomat and writer that lived in the 16th century. His name was Leo Africanus, right? He was said to be a North African that was enslaved by the Europeans, taken to Europe. He was freed after he discovered that he was a prominent writer, and so on and so forth. Anyways, he wrote a book in Italian. I think the English name of the book will be Descriptions of Africa, thereabout. And in the book, that's where he gave it the name Niger. But I don't think that was the original pronunciation, because he coined the name himself. Being a North African, he was a member of the Berber tribe, one of the Berber tribes. So the name in the Berber language was something similar to Nger, right?
Say it again.
Please don't make me do that. Nger. So somewhere meaning it means the river of rivers. Right. So somewhere in contracting the name, or maybe extracting the name river from Ger, since that means
I doubt you're saying this thing right.
I doubt that. I'm not a speaker of the Tuareg language or any of the Berber languages. Anyways, from contracting it and trying to simplify it for his European audience, he came up with the name Niger, which I suppose the intended pronunciation the original will have been something more like Nger.
Yes.
Nger. Something. Anyway, but
Nigeria.
we know it as Niger today. And
I think I'll start calling Nigeria.
Well, you sound ridiculous and people will laugh at you every single time you say that. We have gone so far into 1897, right? And the British influence in the region didn't start in 1897. Right? Actually, the Britain, the country, the empire, have had a presence in the region, right? And their influence in the region began as far back as the 18th century, when they, together with the other European powers, and then they participated in the slave trade. Right, they come with their ships together with the other European powers. We discussed extensively in the previous episode about the actions of the Portuguese, right? Essentially, the Portuguese, they were the main European powers back then in the 16th century and forward. Actually, the influence of the Portuguese reduced later on in the 17th century because they combined with, they became part of Spain, right? They became part of Spain, and then their influence reduced greatly until later on when they separated from Spain, and then they tried to regain some of their influence, but then it was already too late. They were already past power by then. Anyways, we're talking about the British today, not the Portuguese. They had their time in the previous episode. Now, so the British had been influential in the region beginning in the 1700s, So they participated in the slave trade, and then all that went on over the next couple of centuries, of course. And then in the year 1807, they finally got tired of it, of the slave trade, and then they passed the Slave Trade Act of 1807. The result of that was the prohibition of slave trade for all British subjects, right, beginning from when that the law was passed. And then in the year 1837, the slavery was abolished totally in the British Empire. So it was abolished, and it was said essentially that, well, although the slavery was abolished and the large ransom for the slaves was paid to the slave owners, right?
I mean, come on, you have to pay them.
But the slaves themselves, over the years, before then, anyways, when the slaves get freed, there's no monetary recompense was paid to them. Most of what was done to them was relocation and rehabilitation, not in Britain, but in Sierra Leone. Now, the Sierra Leone was established as a territory for freed slaves, right? Although not just free British slaves now, also freed slaves from the local region, because we talk about the various wars that broke out. And then when you have slaves from there, many of them relocated to Sierra Leone. But also, yes, you have slaves that you have freed in Britain, and then they were relocated and they rehabilitated in Sierra Leone there. Right.
And what do you expect now? Just
well, I'm not complaining. They did what they did, and it is what it is. We are where we are
for
today.
the slave owners, they have to be paid. Now, you can't just come and just
it was a
feed their
business, right?
just feed their commodity.
Well, my quarrel with that mainly is that, well, yes, you paid them, but these people have been deprived of what it means to be human, of every opportunity to develop, right? In every reasonable way, in any measurable way, throughout their entire lives. At least something should be done for them to
go ahead and affect their generation.
Well, in America, there was the promise of the 1 acre and a mule, right? Yeah, that was never
came to fruition.
It never came to fruition. But that one is a different matter entirely. But then here, the promise wasn't even there, and then nothing was done, although their owners were paid. It's all stuff we're going to talk about. It's basically, we'll come to talk about it too here, about we ourselves, the Nigeria, right? You know, further on, we'll talk about the Royal Niger Company and how their charter was abrogated, and then what happened afterwards. But before we get there, let's please go back a bit and talk about British influence in the region. Anyway, so we said the British influence has been around since the 18th century, right, when they participated in the slave trade. And then we talked about the Slave Trade Act of 1807 and the abolition of slavery totally in 1834. And we also touched on the establishment of Sierra Leone as a colony to serve as
place for rehabilitation.
Right. So, following the abolition of slave trade, since they already have influence in Sierra Leone, what they did was they annexed Freetown, which is today the capital of Sierra Leone, right, yes, as a colony, and they established a naval base there. So what they did with naval base is use that as a base for launching their naval military operations, right, in the region. Because, well, we no longer participate in the slave trade, we no longer gain from it. Nobody else will. Nobody else should. So
try anything.
We are not basically, we're not saying the slave trade was good, but that's essentially what it sounded like, and that's essentially what they did. So that was that, and over the next couple of years, the British tried to penetrate up the Niger River through the south, from the south of what we now know as Nigeria, of course. They tried to penetrate up to the Sokoto Caliphate, especially to try to see how they could put an end to the wars that were happening there, right? Because what you understand about these wars, the wars that were happening, right, generating a lot of chaos and unrest in the region, was affecting business. So I think I don't know if we touched about this in the previous episode, about how I wondered what it was that brought them in the first place. Was it just the goodness of their heart, or what was it? Yeah, because you see a lot in their documentation about how they talk about they wanting to spread civilization
to this part of the
yes.
world.
Now, the thing is this: when they say they want to spread civilization, what they mean is that they want the people that live in this place to adopt their style, both their lifestyle and their economic style. Because it's only when that happens that reasonable trade could take place between them. So essentially, everything they're talking about here is trade, money. How could they establish trade with these people? That it will not be possible to establish reasonable trade with these people if they have different systems, if they don't have the same basic understanding of what trade is. Right? So that's basically what they're talking about when they say they want to spread civilization here. It's not about making them wise. No, of course, these people had a culture. They have had cultures for hundreds and thousands of years. Right? So what they want is for them to adopt their own culture, so that they could relate on a more equal, not equal, but on a more level ground.
All in all, they're just out for the gains. They did all they could,
and lots of gains. Now you see, here is an example, right, of how much gain they were making. It was said that, I can't remember the particular year when these statistics were taken, but it was later in the 19th century, that that one of the major goods that they got from here, right, that they come here to trade for, is palm oil. Right? Palm oil was being produced in large amounts, and this was in the 19th century. It was being produced in large amounts here.
Machines and stuff.
Exactly. Now, the palm oil they were getting here, right, was worth a lot of money, of course, right? So they get the palm oil here, and then they transport it back to Britain, and it gets processed and into various other goods. It was said that in the late 19th century, the global palm oil trade was worth in excess of £1 billion per year.
Wow!
And
wow.
That's not 2021 currency.
That is.
You see how crazy that is?
Mad.
So you have to understand, they weren't here for goodness. They were here for their own goodness, anyways. Their own goodness that did not trickle down to this place where they were getting the money. Right? So they are just here essentially just getting the stuff. Yes. And we talk about slave trade a lot and everything. It was said that also that although they put an end to slave trade, as they were putting at the end to slave trade, and people couldn't buy the slaves anymore. Remember that in 19th century these wars were still going on. We just talked about why they had to put an end to the wars, because it was affecting business. Now, this wars was still generating slaves, because you defeat a place now, the citizens are being expelled as slaves. So they need somewhere else to go. So many of the slaves that are being generated from these wars, we are used to work on these palm plantations. So the palm oil trade, of course, benefited a lot from slave labor, right? And the British themselves, right? They said they abolished slavery in their empire, but actually there are reports that they themselves used human labor, right, in a way that was tantamount to slavery. The way they used human labor here. This saying is some of the least inhuman practices of theirs. There are reports, there have been countless writings of their activities all over in their territories, right? The place they pronounce as their protectorates. Things they did, in East Africa, the camps they created where they isolated people, and there's this inhuman practices there. What they did in Uganda, for example, that one is a different matter entirely. But if you want to know how badly they messed up the area that is now known as Uganda, is just go into your head and think of whatever you think of when you remember the name of Idi Amin, and then you should know that the Idi Amin was as a result of them. As a matter of fact, they trained Idi Amin as a soldier. So Idi Amin is a product of British colonization in Uganda. Direct product, not product of a product, direct product, and then whatever he did, he was trained to do by the British. And then, if you think bad of him, don't just think bad of him. Think bad of the people that created him. Yes, because they created him.
It's not really just unique to the British themselves. Europeans in general, we have the Belgians.
Right. You see, now the thing is this, right? It's bad, and it's not unique to them, but they have the unique position. That unique hypocritical position.
Yes.
Right. They do have that, so you have to flog them for that.
I mean, Portuguese, Angola, is it?
Yes, in Angola, right? Bad. Yeah, the Belgians in Congo and all over Central Africa too. The French everywhere else in Africa.
They just did us bad.
They did us bad, big time. And I don't know if you'll be able to touch on this in this episode about how even after many of these countries, including your dear country here, Nigeria, after they achieved independence, right? Well done. After we achieved independence in quotes, the economy was still firmly in the hands of the colonial masters. So we achieved independence, but we weren't actually decolonized.
We're still in
right, for the most part, for many years afterwards, and many will argue till today, right? Like you see, whatever happens in French Africa, for God's sake, we still have coups in francophone countries, African countries, essentially, in 2021. Right, and many when you look into the reports of what happened, you see the hands of the French government many times in it. But that is not a discussion for today. Actually, this is a discussion we have planned for the next episode. Episode 4, we'll be looking at the legacies of colonization, right? But so although we'll be talking about it in Nigeria, but then we can't help but make reference to what happened elsewhere in Africa too when we discuss this topic. But all that, as you said, will be the topic of our next episode. Right now, in this episode, we're looking at the early history of Nigeria. Alright, so in the year 1851, there was a succession dispute about who is the rightful king, someone who was banished wrongfully and then he wants to take back his throne. And this was in Lagos. There's a succession dispute, and we discussed how disputes that have the potential to break into war will affect trade, of course. And Lagos, the area of Lagos has been a particular strategic location for trade, right, over the past century or so at this point, because of its location on the coast. The area essentially have served as a base for trade to happen, right? So the British, in the year 1851, they intervened in this succession dispute in Lagos, and over the next couple of years, in 1861 particularly, they annexed the entire city of Lagos, right, as a colony of Britain, and this serves as the beginning of Britain's official presence in the region, right? Now, Britain annexed Lagos in 1861 and established the Oil River Protectorate in 1884. Now, we'll go through all this and then we'll come back later to talk about what do we mean by the Oil River Protectorate. All this we'll explain in a short while. British influence in the Niger area increased gradually over the 19th century, but Britain did not effectively occupy the area until 1885. In case that doesn't ring a bell, that was the year that the conference in Berlin took place, right? And that was when the other European powers acknowledged Britain's dominance over the area. From 1886 to 1899, much of the country was ruled by the Royal Niger Company. We'll come back to talk about what this company, their activities and what they did, how they came by, what they did and how did they end, right? So their activities in the region officially ended when they handed over the territories that they controlled to the British government in the year 1900, right? And in 1900, the Southern Niger Protectorate and Northern Niger Protectorate passed from the hands of the Royal Niger Company to the Crown. That's the British government. And then at the urging of the governor, that's now the heads of the local governments of British territories are known as governors, right? So now the governor of Nigeria, beginning in 1900, when the Royal Niger Company handed over control of the territory to the British government, at that point, the area known as Nigeria today consisted of two different regions known as protectorates. There's the Northern Nigerian Protectorate and the Southern Nigerian Protectorate. The Northern Nigerian Protectorate, the governor at this point was Frederick Lugard, who we all know, of course, from our history classes. Now, in 1914, the two territories were amalgamated as the colony and protectorate of Nigeria, while maintaining considerable regional autonomy among the three major regions. We talk about what the three major regions were, but they are similar to what later became the three major regions later in today's Nigeria still, of course, but later still in the during the history and the evolution of the Nigerian country. So that was the Northern Protectorate, the Southern Protectorate, and the colony of Lagos. So we come to talk about these different protectorates and what they meant, of course. And over the years, there were various constitutions were enacted. I think if you studied, governments in secondary school or some aspect of history, I don't know, maybe even social studies in the later parts of junior secondary school, you got to talk about the different constitutions that were enacted right before independence. Various of these constitutions, right, provided for increasing representation and electoral government by Nigerians. The reason why this is particularly important is because earlier on during the colonial rule, right, Nigerians weren't allowed to be part of the government. I know, as we discussed in the next episode, this is one of the major failures of the British in their colonial rule of the region of Nigeria. The racist systems that they employed, you couldn't participate in the government, you couldn't serve as officers in the British Army. That was earlier on, of course. Later on, it all changed. But earlier on, yeah, you couldn't serve as officers, you couldn't be doctors in the army. It all sounds crazy today, but
you come to our country, you establish a government, you prevent us
from participating in it. And many of the problems that we have today as a country started from many of the activities then. I don't know if you'll have the time to discuss it here in this episode, but basically that was how it went down. We want to talk a bit about some of these various regions whose name we mentioned and how they came to be and what's happened with them over the years. Now, we discussed about how the British intervened in the succession dispute in Lagos in 1851, right? And how they annexed Lagos in 1861, making Lagos the base from which the British influence continued to grow and to spread into the country, right? Now, so in such a way, the British declared Lagos as a colony first, right? So from there, how did their influence grow? First, over time, because the Yoruba lands then were still engrossed in these wars that were taking place. So they named Lagos as their colony. They named the entirety of the Yoruba land, what we now know as the Southwest, right, as a protectorate of theirs, right? So it's an area where they establish their influence, so they get to wade in and to stop these wars that were taking place and to basically put an end to them, right? So that was what gets to be known as the Lagos Protectorate. So there was the Lagos Colony and Lagos Protectorate, right? Now, this is just the Southwest, right? That gets to be known as the Lagos Colony and Lagos Protectorate, right? There's also the Southeast, right? There was stuff going on in these places then. Now, this region, right, of the South and Southeast was what was known at this point as the Oil Rivers Protectorate. the Oil Rivers Protectorate was established in 1884, and it was confirmed as belonging to the British in the conference of the following year, 1885, the Berlin Conference. So after that, in 1893, if I remember correctly, it was renamed as the Niger Coast Protectorate. Now, this Niger Coast Protectorate was when it gets merged, right? It gets merged with what's known as the chartered territories of the Royal Niger Company below the River Niger, and then gets to be known as Southern Nigeria. But then, this Royal Niger Company, what about them? What is their deal? Now, the Royal Niger Company was formed in the year 1879 as the United African Company, right? Basically, their formation is attributed to Tubman Goldie, right? Tubman Goldie is one of the men that was credited with the formation of the country known as Nigeria today, similar to the influence of Cecil Rhodes in South Africa, right? Except that him, Tubman Goldie, or John Goldie as he was born as, he himself was shy of publicity. So basically, you find out that later on, maybe when he formed the company, he didn't place himself as the head. He placed someone else as the head. Even though he was responsible for the formation of the country, there was someone else at the head. So basically, he was in the background and getting things done, while someone else was the figurehead.
The Royal Niger Company is similar to the East Indian Company back in India.
Similar to the East Indian Company, yes, because their formation was different. When I was reading up on this, I saw that there were some antagonism to the formation, because some people would criticize it and said there were fears that what happened to the East India Company would happen to it too. The East India Company suffered from a breakup right after a while, because essentially what these companies are just amalgamation of several different companies with similar interests. So they get chartered together as a single company, and then they carry out their commercial and colonialist activities in these territories, right? So now, the Royal Niger Company was formed as the United African Company in 1879, right? It was formed as a result of, you see, what happened was when there were many companies, many British companies, right? They were trading in the Niger region, right? Essentially Nigeria today, and then they were competing with each other for this produce. And when you have a competition like this, what happened is prices fall down, right? And then they were all suffering from it. So basically, what he did was, it got them to agree that, okay, these falling prices, these low prices is bad for all of them. And the solution he proposed, of course, was a merger, right? So the merger did happen, and in 1879, the United African Company was formed. The British government, of course, at first failed to grant them a charter because there were concerns about how the company was formed and about their ability to carry out what they put forward as their mandate. And then Tubman Goldie was responsible for gathering the necessary capital, with the result that in the year 1886, when they satisfied the concerns of the government, they got the charter. And then when they got the charter, they were renamed from the United African Company to the Royal Niger Company. Although it was said that earlier on, of course, there was a different change of name, but basically they got renamed as the Royal Niger Company in 1886 after they got their charter. The charter basically gave them dominion over what we now know as Nigeria, right? The region of their influence was said to range from as far east as the Sokoto Caliphate to much of the part of the Borno Empire in the east there. So basically, the Royal Niger Company, their charter allowed them to rule over the Niger territories consisting of the Niger waterways, the Sokoto Caliphate, and the Borno Empire and the Benue Valley. By the way, fun fact here, You know the artist called Jesse Jags?
Yes,
You do know of him, of course, right?
Favorite.
Yeah, one of my favorite artists of all. He has a music album, right? Called the Royal Niger Company.
Interesting.
Right? He said to have named it such because he wanted people to take interest in their history and to read, of course. Because if you get to read about the Royal Niger Company, you get to know more about your history as a Nigerian, where you came from, what this country has been through over the years, and the things that happened with colonial rule here.
I think even Burna Boy tried to do something like that last time. Tried to talk about I think Nigeria Delta Company.
Okay, yeah, he did talk about the actions of foreigners, the colonial masters, but he did touch a bit more on the governments themselves, the present government. I don't think it wasn't.
He did.
Yeah. I was getting pointers to the present day government to there in the sun. So yeah, that was about that. Just a fun fact. By the way, I think one of these days we should do something about that. Maybe one of our music reviews will be about Jesse Jags' album, and definitely we'll be doing some of Burna Boy's too. All right, now. Remember we said the British government gave granted the charter to the Royal Niger Company, right, in 1886, and basically that gave them dominion over much of what is known as Nigeria today, or to be more precise, northern Nigeria. Now, in the year 1900, however, because of the increased presence of government-supported companies, not just any companies now, but rather French and German companies around the region, right? Which is basically why Nigeria today is surrounded by francophone countries, right? If not for the First World War, however, these countries wouldn't have just been francophone countries. We would have had a couple of German-speaking countries there too, pointing at Cameroon specifically. But then, because of that, these countries were handed over to different colonial masters. So it's mostly the French and the British. But then, because of the increased presence of these foreign government-supported companies in the region, the British government had to abrogate the Royal Niger Company's charter in the year 1900 because they wanted to have a direct presence in the region and direct influence over what's happening in the region. Prior to this, we come to talk about this.
Same thing happened in India also. Just took charge of the whole East Indian Company.
Exactly.
Shoved it and just
exactly. There are a bunch of reasons for that, but of course, the most direct reason will be because of the presence of foreign competition. And then the government, because basically how the British went by the stuff at first was that it was private companies.
Yes.
They were doing this, not the government itself. Okay, the British government had presence in the southern part of the country, but for the northern part, they had no presence. It was just these privately owned companies that were mostly acting there. And if you look at the history of the Royal Niger Company, there was talk of the different conflicts that happened there, the competitions between the Royal Niger Company and these foreign companies, and even some other British companies that weren't part of them. And there was this particular period of time when there was this price war, right? When they engaged in a 2-year price war, and they used it to ruin some of their competitions because they were backed by serious money. Tomagodi raised about £1 million, right, before they were granted the charter. So they had serious money backing them, and they just used it to compete unfairly. Although, for the sake of being balanced, actually, the British companies, they weren't competing against foreign companies alone. They were also competing against certain local traders. The most prominent of these today, and the most famous of them, would be King Jaja of Okpobo. Really, Jaja of Okpobo, the reason we know of that he was abducted and he was sent on exile, right? Yes. Why was he sent on exile? It was because the Yao of Okobo, in his area of influence, he was refusing British entrance. Yes, and then he was taxing them. Seriously,
Smart guy.
I mean, he was really badass. He was actually taxing the British. Really putting a check on the activities in his area there. What did they do in the end? They tricked him onto a British warship under the pretext of wanting to negotiate with him. And then the moment he stepped onto the warship, they arrested him. They didn't assault him. They said they were going to negotiate with him. What will you do if a person who he has superior firepower to you invited you to negotiate? Of course, you have to go to negotiate, right?
You should have been there at the back of your mind that it's probably just.
And this was a warship, not just any other vessel, not a boat, not just any other boat, not a canoe. It's a warship. So he went on, and the moment he stepped foot on it, he was placed under arrest, transported first to Britain and then to the Caribbean.
Wow.
He spent 4 years in exile, and by the time he was allowed to come back home, he died on the way in 1891. That was, by the way, anyways, just to be balanced and to establish that actually we had local troops at CH that were even competing with the British back then. But their main competition was with other British companies and with the foreign companies, the French and German companies. They were trained into anyways. So in the year 1900, the British abrogated the charter, and then they proceeded to establish control over territories, right? And all these territories include the areas where it has claimed influence at the Berlin Conference, right? Because now at the Berlin Conference, the places that were handed over to Britain included not only places where the British government had presence, but places where British companies, such as the Royal Niger Company, had influence, where they had the presence. So first, the British government now, after abrogating the charter, they amalgamated the Lagos colony and the Lagos protectorate. We talked about this earlier on, right? The Lagos colony and the protectorate with the Niger Coast protectorate, and by amalgamating that, they created the protectorate of Southern Nigeria. Right? Exactly. So after that, the Frederick Lugard, we talked about him being the first governor of Northern Nigeria, right? Now this here is the story of how he got to that position. In the year, I think this was in the year 1897, he was appointed to recruit troops into what was known as the West African Frontier Force, right? And this frontier force, their mandate was to put a check on French and German activity in the region that was the territory of the Royal Niger Company. So this was around the year 1897, just before the abrogation of the charter of the company, right? So this was his mandate to check the activities using by controlling the activities of the West Africa Frontier Force, being their commander essentially. Now, but that wasn't just it. They was also charged with conquering the kingdoms and empires, right? They were most influential in northern Nigeria at the time. Most notably the Sokoto Caliphate, of course, and then you have the Borno up in the northeast there too. Although the Borno Empire there was said to have rather be an easy catch for them, because Borno at that point was already engaged in a war with the what's it called? I can't remember. From the an adventurer that came from the Nile region. Anyways, it was overthrown, and Borno basically surrendered to the British without much of a fight. But this was a bit later on, of course. Now, so with that, in the year 1900, right? In short form, from 1897, he got the West African Frontier Force. In 1900, he had the entire northern region under him, and then the charter was abrogated, and he was named as the governor of the protectorate of Northern Nigeria. And he served as the governor for a couple of years, I think till 1906 or so, when he was transferred elsewhere, and then we had successive other governors, but then he was brought back as the governor of Northern Nigeria in 1912, if I remember correctly. And the reason he was brought back was to see a way, right, to merge the whole region together, right? Basically, amalgamation of Nigeria as we know it, right? The amalgamation, was the reason they brought him back in 1912. And then in 1914 was when the amalgamation finally happened. And then it was said that it was basically the way the British ruled was that at least the local government here, right, the local region, the Nigeria here, was that they depended largely on custom duties to finance their administration, and much of the custom duties is from the coastal region, of course, right? So the coastal region, as the southern Nigeria basically, was generating a lot more money than the northern part of the country, right? The northern part of the country was you're getting some money from the northern part to one of the names that will arrive into this was the name of Alassane Tata, who at the time was said to be like the wealthiest man in West Africa, at that time, of course. So he was basically engaging in, he was selling raw materials to the British and so on and so forth, engaging in imports and export of European goods and was basically selling materials to them too. And but basically much more money was being generated in the southern parts, largely, as we said here, due to customs duty that they were getting from there. And so since it makes sense that much of the finance of the administration was being generated in that way, it made sense to him that to amalgamate the landlocked northern Nigeria with the southern Nigeria and the coastline, of course, into a single country, right? And we talked about how the country earlier on, the name came to be, of course.
Sure.
Exactly. Now, this act, of course, over the years, the act of amalgamating the entire region has been criticized soundly. It's been soundly criticized over the years because this was mainly, right, as many see it, and if I may say rightly so, as many see it too, because they failed to offer any sort of buffer to basically correct the cultural shock that will happen from bringing these cultures. Not just two. Now, there are many different cultures and regions together, right, as one entity, and not just what was needed was not just any sort of buffer, but these people, now if you're bringing them as one, right, they need to get used to each other over time. But then the British saw to it that they were kept apart as much as possible. In fact, right, it was said that under the successive British governors, right, governors general as they got to be known after the amalgamation, that the rulers of the different parts of the country weren't even allowed to meet themselves. At a point in time, it was said that the rulers were named as part of an advisory committee, right? They were supposed to meet with the Governor General once a year. But then when it's time for the meeting was, what only happened in the meeting was that the Governor General simply just reads out rules to them, the rules, okay, if there was any changes that they want to take place, what is it they want to get done, that they want them to do with the people, with the indirect and everything. And then there was actually no advice that was coming from them to the Governor General on how to rule the people. Basically, it was just the Governor General handing its own rule down to them, and then there was no discourse happening there. So as they come, it's the same way they go.
Yes.
Exactly. And so they basically just kept the whole thing apart. Instead of trying to make everybody live together, they fed off by keeping the people apart as much as they could. And of course, all this had telling results on the country. We come to see about the various devastating results that it had on the country, and that it still has up until today, right? And more immediately following independence, these problems that were generated from this act of theirs, or they were what led to the civil war, which is all its telling devastation and all what happened back then, of course. Okay, now so we've got to discuss amalgamation, right? How that came to be and everything else. Now, following amalgamation, the central issue in Nigerian politics, right? At this point in time, we've started having a number of educated people who are in school, both here and abroad. Although, basically here back then there was, if you are to be educated, right, you only undergo the basic education here. The rest of your education, the tertiary education, will have to take place outside. And most of the people that were educated here then had to finish their education in Britain, right? There was basically no tertiary institution here until much later when the University College Ibadan was established. This was much later, I think, after the Second World War, right? Talking the 50s. Yeah, the 50s actually. And why did it get so late before the University College was established? Actually, it was attributed to the racism of the British, right? The people who were ruling the place. Lugard specifically was said to have been opposed to the education of the populace here, and he's a bit of a hypocrite himself. I think we get to discuss a bit more of this in the next episode. But you see, he was opposed to the education of the populace here. But when he was made the governor, because he was made the governor of Hong Kong for a brief period there, he was actually jointly responsible for the establishment of the University of Hong Kong. Although even there too, at first he was opposed, and then he became open to it. And then when he became open to it, and then he actually was part of the founders of the university there. After the founding of the university, he actually prevented them from teaching, many ideals and ideas such as democracy at the university. It was so ridiculous. Even when I was reading it, I couldn't believe what I was saying. But then, basically, following then, at this point in time, we have started having a couple of educated people around here too, and then there have been the development of an elite group, right? We started having these allies themselves, and then some of the central issue amongst them is what is generally referred to as the national question, right? How do we go forward with this, right? How do we form a nation, right, from all this that's happening around them, with the colonial rule and everything? How do you form a nation, and what kind of nation are we going to form? Right? We're going to see what's happened with this in short order. So all this includes how to establish a framework to encourage the peaceful coexistence and equitable sharing of resources and responsibilities in the country. This is very important. If the country is to exist at all and to exist as one, this needs to be taken care of. Now, under the indirect rule system of the colonial masters, of course, little was done in that regard. Like we said just a short while ago, it was done in that regard until after World War II. Right? It wasn't until after World War II, between the years 1946, if I remember correctly, to 1946 or to 55. Right? That was when talked previously about the various constitutions that were enacted then, right? Yeah, that was the period when most of those constitutions were put into writing, right? So the educated elite, that we described shortly, began from around the year 1620s. That was, to be specific now, in the years following the First World War, right? So they began after this period to agitate for improved facilities for higher education and for opportunities for employment in the colonial service. Like we said previously, earlier on in this episode, that locals, right, with the blacks, were not allowed to work as part of the colonial government earlier on. Of course, so this was part of what the educated elites that we began having at this point started fighting for. And so after the Second World War, that's after 1940, they started agitating for decolonization, right? If you see works that were written in this period, you see elements of this inside. One particular one comes to mind. This was from a long time ago, but I don't know, it just stuck out in my mind. This was the sequel to Eze Goes to School. I think that's Eze Goes to College, right?
Yes.
Yeah, Eze Goes to College. There was this scene there where Eze was discussing with one of his secondary school mates about how Azikiwe was the writings of Azikiwe, what he was writing about in his newspaper then, and how they were fighting for independence, and that was Azikiwe and his colleagues back then too. But that comes to mind there. So if you see works that were written this way, the elements of this reflect in there very boldly. And so the end of colonial rule came rapidly after this period. Of course, the colonial rule came to an end, but no real decolonization was done, right? Because if you are going to decolonize the place, you have to look at the effects that colonization has had on the people and on the region, and you try to correct many of those effects, right? Over the many years before you finally declare the place as being decolonized, the locals, right, need to be a sizable population, right, of the local populace that have undergone training and that have experience in working in the kind of government that they will be establishing. This is what you find out that didn't happen here, right? You said following the Second World War, you start having what's it called now? The constitutions that were being written. The first few constitutions that were written like in this manner weren't even written here. They were written in the colonial offices over in Britain, in London, right? And then they were brought back. So you see, there was no real decolonization taking place because the locals weren't being carried along, right? And this is what you see. It's what later came around to cause much problem for the country later on, even after independence, right? Because you find out that what they didn't want to happen was the country wasn't going to be handed over to the traditional rulers, right? But under indirect rule, it was the traditional rulers that were being given power, right? Because now you are ruling. What was being done was they were ruling the people by giving orders to the traditional rulers, and the traditional rulers only serve as their puppet, if you will, right? As their mouths to the people, and then they hand out their orders down to the people, right? But looking back in time now, following independence, it wasn't the traditional rulers who were ruling, right? It's the civil populace, the civilians now, right? And the civilians were people who didn't have this extensive experience working as in the government previously, and that's how you start having problems, right? And much problems did they have too. A lot of problems did they have. I mean, in the years following the Civil War, it was said how there are reports still today that you can see of how the entire Southwest was on fire arson all over the place, the riots, not in the southwest, the middle belt too, the reports of rampant corruption in government and everywhere all around the country. It was basically the Wild West all over the place. Right, and this was as a result of all this, and just having action for action's sake. And okay, you can't say that's not totally true, anyways, because they really knew what they were doing. Right, they didn't want to prepare the country, because if you actually hand these people the tools they need to, really exist as a strong entity, then you wouldn't be able to establish control, to maintain control over them, even after you supposedly decolonize them, or you supposedly hand them independence. Right. So, please, you have to forgive us for going on this lengthy rant. All right then. It's only a crime of passion. All right. Which is well. Okay. All right. So we talked about the university college, right, being established, the Colonial University College being established, after many years of agitation, of course, in Ibadan. And this was, basically to expand the training of the elite, that is to replace the British colonial officers and to take over power from the traditional rulers, right, that had been trained to govern under the direction of the British during the indirect rule, of course. So basically with that, right, and with what we've explained in our rant, or to be specific, in my rant, independence, in quotes now, independence, it did come in 1960, but it came with politicians who had, like I said, little or no experience in government, and with the economy. Now, with the economy firmly in British and American hands, and we had what we had following that, and following independence, how the country had to struggle with all these problems and the various calamities that happened with the Civil War, and the shift to military rule and all that followed in the following years. And of course, we have that we still battle with many of the effects of colonial rule, right, colonization in general, till this very day, right? But I think what we've tried to establish so far is just basically an early history of Nigeria, right, of what is known as Nigeria today. In the previous episode, we saw the ancient history. This episode, we looked at the history of Nigeria. Basically, the working title for the episode was a 19th century history, but I will only cover like half of what we are to talk about, right? So basically, this is just the history of early Nigeria as we know it today. And we hope it's been informative and that you've been able to keep you interested. Ada, looking at this, it's looking like this is going to be another hour-long episode, if not an hour 30 minutes, or even two, right? But I believe, if you listen to it and you get the information that's been passed, I think it makes up for the time it takes. And it's a podcast. It doesn't sound, you don't have to sit down for the entire hour doing nothing else but listen to the podcast.
Some people might argue that you require energy to do that, to just listen, and they want to get everything, every point.
I don't see why you can't get everything if you have your phone in your pocket and you have
there's something called absent-mindedness. You just go.
All right. So we hope you enjoyed the episode, of course, and thanks a lot for sticking with us.
Thank you very much
for this long.
As usual, Ada out.
Yeah, and this is the scientist turning out too. And remember to join us for the next episode. Next episode, we said we'll be discussing the legacy of colonial rule, right?
Yes.
All right. Thank you. See you on the next one.
the Horn of Africa.